Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ron Halber, and I serve as the CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's timely and important conversation on the brink of peace, that's with a question mark, featuring Dr. Robert Satloff, who I also want to thank for making himself so available to us on a moment's notice. I also want to thank my colleagues, Adam Odessa and Charlotte Barrios, for their work in organizing today's webinar. For those who don't know, the JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in the greater Washington region, representing over 100 Jewish institutions. And part of our mission is to educate and empower and mobilize our community to advocate for and engage thoughtfully with Israel, a mission that remains especially critical during this pivotal time. Tomorrow, we mark 2 years since the horrific October 7th attack, the deadliest day in Israel's history and the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. 48 hostages remain in Hamas activity, and we hope with renewed diplomatic efforts that we heard about over the weekend that there's a possibility of a ceasefire and a peace agreement, and everybody will see their loved ones return. We're not under any illusions. We know there's many pitfalls, but we do hope. To help us understand where we currently stand, we're honored to be joined by my friend, Dr. Robert Satloff, who's the longtime executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and one of the most respected voices on U.S.-Israel relations and Middle East policy. But before we begin, a quick few housekeeping tips. Dr. Satloff will share his insight, followed by a moderated question and answer session. If you have any questions, please put them in the QA feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to as many of them as possible. The session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Satloff. Dr. Satloff, thank you for being with us today, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group today. As you noted, we are on the eve of the second anniversary of the October 7th attacks. I can only relate that I'm sure, like just about everyone on this call, very few of us thought that 2 years after that event, we would still be talking about how can we secure the release of Israel's hostages from Gaza? How can we bring this horrific war to a close? How can we turn the page to a new chapter where Israelis can be secure in their southern communities? And we could think about where we were on October 6th. October 6th, we should recall, the news of the Middle East was, are we on the verge of a huge breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and expanding the Abraham Accords and dramatically opening Israel's aperture to the Middle East and deepening its integration into the region? Sadly, on one level, Hamas has succeeded in taking that agenda and making it, sadly, at best, a hopeful future agenda, but certainly not one where we are now celebrating the second anniversary of Israel's peace with Saudi Arabia. We are hopeful, I am hopeful, that we are turning a page on this, and that when we reconvene a year from now for the third anniversary of the October 7th attacks, we're talking about a totally different set of issues, that we're talking about Israel's deep integration in the Middle East, that we're talking about how Israel can expand and deepen its relationship with other Arab and Muslim countries, and that we're not talking about horrible accusations of genocide and Israel's isolation that we are facing today. So why is today different? It sounds like a Passover question, but why is today different from every other episode when we thought that perhaps we were on the verge of diplomatic breakthrough? What is it about what President Trump has done that sets it apart from his own previous efforts and efforts of President Biden to transform battlefield success, which the Israelis have shown, into diplomatic achievement, which the Israelis have been unable to accomplish. Well, I think there's a few factors, and we should go into it because as we speak, what we hope is the home stretch is beginning to take place in Cairo, where Hamas has arrived with the Egyptians, with other Arab and Muslim parties. The Israelis and the Americans will show up in a couple of days. And the hope is that by the end of the weekend, before what for the Israelis will be the second anniversary, namely before Simchat Torah, before Shmini Atzeret, we actually have a real breakthrough. So what did Donald Trump do that was different this time? The first thing that he did was that he lined up the Arab and Muslim countries to address Israel's basic needs. I'm not referring to the UN General Assembly meetings or some passage of an UNGA resolution, which did occur a couple of weeks ago. Rather, I'm referring to President Trump bringing together in New York the key Arab countries, together with a wider array of Muslim countries, Turkey, Indonesia, even Pakistan. God knows when the Pakistanis were ever involved in Arab-Israeli peacemaking. But bringing together these three major countries in the Muslim world to all endorse his approach. That was before he brought Bibi Netanyahu to Washington. And then in that intervening period, after the Arab and Muslim countries endorsed the overall approach, the Israelis were able to secure from the Trump White House a few key amendments to the original 21-point plan that made it even more attractive to them. A couple of key points, especially linking disarmament, defining disarmament of Hamas in a more specific way, defining the actual terms with greater specificity, and then getting Netanyahu to embrace this. On the Monday, a week ago today, getting Netanyahu to embrace this plan as fulfilling Israel's war aims, a huge success. And then Trump, and really only Donald Trump was able to do this, without renegotiating those additional terms that Netanyahu and Ron Dermer were able to get from Trump. He got the Arabs and Muslims again to re-endorse the now amended 20-point plan that he worked out with Bibi Netanyahu. They all didn't get a chance to focus on the details too much. Trump is not himself focused on the details too much, but he wanted the Arabs and the Muslims to box in Hamas and Netanyahu equally. He put his embrace around Netanyahu. The Arabs and Muslims boxed in Hamas, and there really was no choice for Hamas but to do the traditional response, which is yes, but. Yes, we agreed to the overall themes of this peace plan, but we have details to work out, and that's where we are today. This will achieve a breakthrough if, in Egypt, they focus on the first phase of what this plan aspires to do. In the first phase, it envisions a full release of Israeli hostages, living and dead. It envisions the transfer of a significant number of Palestinian prisoners out of Israeli prisons, and it envisions the first phase of Israel's military redeployment inside Gaza and an opening of the borders for the flood of humanitarian goods. If the negotiations in Egypt focus on that phase, then I think there's a reasonable chance of success. However, if if the talks in Egypt focus on everything from point 1 to point 20 of the 20-point plan, if they decide they want to detail the execution of every phase foreseen in this plan, every phase of Israeli withdrawal, every aspect of Hamas's disarmament and demilitarization, every phase of the deployment of Arab and Muslim forces, every phase of the setup of the Gaza Transitional Authority of Palestinian technocrats under the auspices of the International Board of Peace that Donald Trump will himself chair. If they take on all these items as a prerequisite to beginning the implementation of phase one, then I fear they will be at the table for a long, long time. That's not what Donald Trump has in mind. Clearly, from his statements last week next to Bibi Netanyahu and from his Truth Social postings over the last week, he wants to get the hostages out and he wants to begin the process of implementation. He doesn't need, from his perspective, every I dotted, every T crossed as to the execution of all 20 points of the 20-point plan. It remains to be seen. It is a big question mark whether Hamas and Israel will themselves require a clarity and definition on how to execute every point of that plan. If they demand it now, then I fear that we're going to be back in the same cul-de-sac we've been in before. And part of that is because the execution of peacemaking will itself have its own positive impact on subsequent phases of the implementation. But if you try to scope it out now, you're not likely to be able to see all the way to the end. There is the positive impact of succeeding incrementally that will have an effect as they move forward. That they won't get the positive impact if they demand that everything be worked out in advance. But that's where we are right now. I do remain hopeful, and that's really because of the Trump factor. To their great credit, the hostage families in recent months adopted a strategy of engaging President Trump and turning him into the great savior of Israel's hostages. They moved beyond their efforts with the government of Israel, about whom they have, shall we say, at best, ambivalent views as to whether securing the release of the hostages or obliterating Hamas is their top priority. For Donald Trump, it has emerged that getting the hostages out is a point of great personal pride and great personal achievement, and would be for him the key to unlocking a ceasefire and perhaps the key to other achievements. Everyone talks about a Nobel Prize. But the key is securing the release of the hostages. And so if he can succeed in convincing the negotiators in Cairo to focus on phase one, those four items I mentioned: hostage release, prisoner release, the first phase of Israel's withdrawal, and the flood of humanitarian goods, then we may have the makings of a breakthrough. We will know this within the next week or so. We will know this fairly soon. We'll know this whether or not the parties get bogged down in things much further on in the implementation. It would be a huge achievement. It doesn't necessarily mean that the day after, which is envisioned in the 20-point plan, will proceed, without hiccups and obstacles. And I think we should all recognize there's a distinction between bringing an end to the fighting and executing a day after plan. The latter is a very complicated enterprise. Right now, they're focused on just the first, on just bringing an end to the fighting via securing the release of the hostages. So if we keep our eye on that prize, we may indeed see a success within a week or so. I don't want to get everyone's hopes up too high, but I do think that the stars are better aligned today than at any point in the past 2 years to at least achieve that threshold of success, which is no small achievement. Why don't I stop there, Ron? And I'm happy to take whatever questions your viewers have.
Right. We actually have quite a few. One of our viewers has said, what if they were to accomplish the 4 points that you outlined in your presentation so far, what leverage would why would Hamas do that? Because they would have, once they give up the hostages, they lose their leverage.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. So in a certain sense, Hamas's leverage goes back to those Arab and Muslim countries that Donald Trump relied on heavily to reach this point. So yes, if Hamas releases the last of the hostages, it would lose a major point of leverage. By the same token, Israel would lose a key rationale for it to continue its military operation. It becomes even more difficult, and not just to the world, but to the Israeli people. It would become even more difficult for Israel to say that it needs to maintain its military operation to impose pressure on Hamas to do fill in the blank.
But Rob, why couldn't they then say the hostages are released and there is still X amount of terrorists who refuse to give up their weapons? We've been trying simultaneously to negotiate the disarmament. They refuse to get to the next step. We got what we want done. But if it stops if it gets to the point where they agree, for example, there's some talk about them giving over some of their heavy weapons to Egypt and other talk about, but they're not giving up their personal arms. But if they remain as an armed force, even if they get through those 4, what is to prevent Israel and Hamas from fighting one last bloody battle to dismantle Hamas politically and militarily?
So I should say it's a distinct possibility. Don't get me wrong. As I tried to say, there's a difference between the hopeful moment of the release of the hostages and what that means for Israel and Israel's friends, and the actual and necessarily the end to this war. What you just described is a possibility. I think the thinking is that there would be such pressure, not least from President Trump, who will have secured for Israel and for this Israeli government, or at least its prime minister, the huge achievement of the release of the hostages.
And who wants to run for re-election.
That now you're getting into the domestic political content. Just to finish the sentence,
Yeah.
that Donald Trump will have secured for himself enormous leverage to determine the next phase of this conflict. Now, in terms of Israeli domestic politics, I think that as Yossi Klein Halevi said on another Washington Institute program early this morning, the release of the hostages would be for Bibi Netanyahu as good as it gets, as a moment to pivot and try to take his strategy back to the people of Israel. As he said at the White House last Monday, this strategy, if successful, would have secured all of Israel's war aims. He could take that and try to run for re-election on that. Now he may, lose his coalition partners in the interim, but that's what elections are all about. They're going to compete for votes, and he will be in at least as strong a position as he will have been since October 7th to try to secure a new mandate. Now, it's difficult for me to imagine at the end of this process any outcome which returns the exact same coalition that Israel currently has. It doesn't, in my view, reflect the changed political makeup of the Israeli body politic as of October, 2025. But it's not unthinkable that Netanyahu, comes out quite well in these elections, if indeed, the next several weeks play out in the positive way that we're discussing.
So my friend Johanna Chanin asks, what impact will the UN, and most especially UNRWA, have on these negotiations and the next phases of a potential plan?
So one of the points in the plan, I don't remember which number it is, envisions that the UN will play a lead role along with the Red Crescent and other institutions in distribution of aid and delivery of services. It doesn't specify within that item on the plan, it doesn't specify UNRWA. And it remains to be seen whether the Israelis are going to insist that UNRWA play no role in this. There is, of course, an Israeli law now on the books where Israel does not have any dealings with UNRWA. The UN has been rather harsh in its own position, which insists that UNRWA play a role in this. They've so far kicked this can down the road. I would imagine that the Israelis would insist that other UN agencies play a role. The United States government, of course, this administration, withdrew funding from UNRWA on day one, so it's unlikely to be sympathetic to calls that UNRWA be restored to a role. But we have to see how this plays out.
So thank you. My friend Ellen Blaylock asks, is Israeli withdrawal to where, and what is and talking to Hamas demilitarization? He's basically asking you if you could define under this agreement what withdrawal would mean and what would demilitarization mean.
Sure. So withdrawal is easier to focus on because there's a map. If you and it's quite available online. You can find it in all sorts of places. The map envisions three phases of withdrawal, basically out of urban areas, and then then further back toward the periphery of Gaza, and then ultimately to a buffer zone that Israel will maintain between a half and 1 kilometer along the perimeter of Gaza on the Gazan side of the border. And it will hold that perimeter buffer zone until everything else in this deal is implemented. And there is agreement that there is zero chance of any armed group undertaking any armed action against Israel. So that will be for some foreseeable, for a considerable period of time. It is envisioned that Israel will retain that buffer on the Palestinian side, if you will, of the Gaza border. Now, exactly, just because it's a line on a piece of paper, exactly how Israeli troops move, exactly what governs the movement of Palestinians within areas within Gaza, who will play the internal security role in areas from which Israel withdraws. These are some of the issues that need to be worked out. Now, this connects to the disarmament issue. In the plan, one of the key items in the plan is an offer that all Hamas members who commit to peaceful coexistence and decommission their weapons, I believe I have the term accurate, commit to peaceful coexistence and submit to decommissioning their weapons will be given amnesty. And those that don't do it will be offered to leave Gaza for Iran, Algeria, Turkey, someplace else, yet to be defined. This phrase, this item, is one of the most important items in the plan and is one of the least defined items in the plan. What does it mean to commit to peaceful coexistence? Bibi Netanyahu in the White House last week actually defined this in a way that he wants to hear, recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Well, that's I think that's legitimate, but not everybody on the Palestinian side thinks that's legitimate. Mahmoud Abbas, for example, the head of the Palestinian Authority, has never recognized Israel as a Jewish state. And it's, in that sense, highly unlikely that Hamas activists, terrorists, are going to do that even in the context of a peace plan or the beginning of one. So if we take that as the highest level of what it means to define peaceful coexistence, it's going to be negotiated down. Decommissioning weapons. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean handing them over? Does that mean putting them into a warehouse? Does that mean destroying them? Does that mean giving them to a third party? What does that actually mean? All this needs to be worked out. And these are still the early phases of the plan. These are not the later phases where we have, third parties entering what is expected to be a more peaceful situation in Gaza. And this is pretty early in the process. So there's a long way to go. I can't tell you that I have all the answers. I can tell you that defining peaceful coexistence, decommissioning, and disarmament, huge, huge issues.
What would you see a stabilization force that is talked about within the points consisting of, like from which nations? And how would Israel be able to, and say it included foreign Arab armies, maybe excluding the Turks, excluding certain other countries that they don't have the best relationship with, if they were on the ground, how would the stabilization actually look like? And how would Israel be able to respond, for example, if attacks were to occur in areas where a stabilization force was in control? And how difficult would it make it for Israel?
Well, you're obviously asking very important, pertinent, and difficult questions. My sense, and this is only a sense talking to all sorts of actors, is that the Arabs and Muslims the Arab and Muslim governments who are supportive of this plan want Palestinian gendarmerie, Palestinian security forces to be responsible for what is left of security in the zones from which Israel will withdraw. That they will be the ones that will be patrolling difficult areas. That their role will be to support the local population, but not to They don't want to get involved in firefights with whatever lingering elements of recalcitrant, Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist fighters might be holding out against this plan. They want Palestinians to play that role, not them. We'll see whether or not there are enough Palestinians who are left over who are being trained in Egypt or left over from even before the PA left Gaza 17 years ago, 16 years ago, whether they're still available to do this role. Which countries might deploy? Well, quite interesting. We had one country at the United Nations make a very specific offer, and that was Indonesia.
Just kind of shocking.
Which was it's actually not the first time that they've spoken about this, but this was the most authoritative way in which they've done it, where the president of Indonesia suggested that they could send up to 20,000 troops to Gaza. And then there are others that have suggested that they'd be willing to deploy, whether it's Emiratis, Moroccans, or others. But again, the point is, none of them want to deploy, none of them want to shoot, to be precise. None of them really want to kill, shoot to kill. They want to be there in a civilian protection function. They want Palestinians to take on other Palestinians. And whether or not, Hamas buys this, whether or not Hamas agrees to this, commits for them and the other smaller, even more radical, it's tough to say more radical, but even more radical groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, whether they're going to sign up to this, big open question.
Here's a pivot. Assuming Dr. Satloff believes that a genocide has not taken place, assuming the answer is no, why do so many American Jews, there were a couple of Washington Post articles over the weekend about American Jewish attitudes, why are so many American Jews, according to the Washington Post, believe that this is so, and how do we combat this narrative?
Well, look, it's difficult for me to get into the minds of individual people. It is, I believe it's a canard, the accusation of genocide. One does not have to applaud every tactical decision that the government of Israel or the IDF has taken in Gaza to reach this conclusion. And I've been, critical of this and that. But I do fully appreciate the extent to which the IDF takes great effort to try to minimize, I don't want to use the term collateral damage. It's dehumanizing, but to try to limit the impact on innocent Palestinians, men, women, and children. This is wholly unprecedented in warfare. What I don't think people have quite wrapped their hands around is the venality. It is the evil of Hamas's strategy in this war. The words human shields don't even begin to describe the strategy that Hamas has adopted. A human shield, if John Doe tries to rob a bank and the police show up and he takes a bank teller and he puts his gun to her head and says, "If you don't let me go, I'm going to kill the bank teller." That's a human shield. He doesn't want, he'd be perfectly happy if to be let go. There's no benefit to killing this person. That's not what is happening in Gaza. Hamas realized early on that the death of Palestinian civilians was actually an asset an asset to be used in a larger war against Israel. They understood something that, regrettably, the Israelis did not fully appreciate, which is that the political war was a battlefield as much as the open field was a battlefield. And Hamas used the political battlefield in a bloodthirsty but terribly effective way. And that every one of those Palestinian kids killed actually was an asset to Hamas. So they had an interest in maximizing the number of Palestinian civilians killed. This is totally unlike that bank robber who gets nothing, no benefit out of killing that human shield. Hamas gets benefit in its own warped image of the battlefield by having all those kids killed. That, to me, is what the genocidal aspect of this war is. And it is horrible that the Israelis played a role in advancing this, but the responsible actor is Hamas for doing everything possible by not providing shelter to their people, by intermingling in civilian areas, in schools and hospitals, and taking over these civilian institutions for military purposes, by putting rockets and missiles in the middle of multi-story buildings, by enmeshing their strategy in the midst of the civilian population. They made themselves responsible. Sadly, the world sees it differently. And so we've had this, I think it's a canard. Again, I don't want to absolve the Israelis of every battlefield decision that they took. But grosso modo, the big picture is that this was anything but genocide. And the big picture is that Hamas is responsible for these civilian deaths. Sadly, the Israelis, however, are paying a political price for all of this.
Two questions. If this ceasefire goes beyond point 4 and they're able to move forward, do you think Israel's international isolation will recede?
So, look, there's a potential for it to happen. There's a potential that Israel's, that the political war against Israel and against Zionism will begin to melt away. But I'm not very optimistic about it. To be perfectly honest, I think that many of Israel's detractors and antagonists are on a roll, and in Europe and parts of the United States, that they're not going to let Israel off the hook, as it were. It is fascinating to me that the Arab and Muslim countries are themselves, committed to making this work. Israel did not lose one of its Arab peace partners, whether the original peace partners, Egypt and Jordan, or the Abraham Accords later peace partners, Morocco, Bahrain, UAE. Not one embassy closed. Israel, not one treaty was suspended throughout the worst of the past 2 years. But yet, you get European countries sitting on their high horse, making all sorts of statements and taking actions against Israel. It is fascinating that the closer you are, other Arab countries, there's actually some pragmatism here. So I think in some quarters, Israel will, the animosity will melt away. But regrettably, I fear in other quarters, the commitment to take on the very essence of Zionism, to take on the very idea of a national home for the Jewish people, has become too deeply rooted, and I fear that that battle is going to continue.
Interestingly, at a time where most of those detractors are probably happening from more of domestic populations in Europe and the United States, and where are on the left, whereas the Arabs themselves were actually the ones in direct negotiation with Israel, becoming more accepting simultaneously. It's sort of a very odd disconnect. What role did Israel's bombing of Qatar play in moving the ceasefire negotiations forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some who who look at Israel's bombing of Qatar and say, ah, how brilliant. Once the Israelis finally made the Qataris and by extension Arab states know that they too could be targets. Finally, they all got sobered up and supported a workable peace plan. I think that's a little too clever by half, to be perfectly honest. Um, uh, if there's any benefit of Israel's raid on Qatar, it was that it uh, it convinced Donald Trump to move into high gear to take the next step on this. Um, Now, I should say I'm no fan of the Qataris. I've been actually quite a critic of their role in this diplomacy and in their role in contributing to some of the worst trends via Al Jazeera for years. So I can say this, with a clean conscience. Um, I don't like the idea that the United States is that the Trump administration has issued an executive order extending a mutual defense guarantee to Qatar. Um, uh, um, I it's 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 not the way I would go about doing this. I understand why Donald Trump has done it. Um, if it is the price that he has paid to finally, at long last, secure the Qataris to be a force for good in trying to secure the release of the hostages and to pressure Hamas into doing something that it would not otherwise do, I'll hold my nose for the time being. Um, 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 but in answer to the question, I think on balance, no, it was. I don't believe that the attack on Doha was itself a helpful contributing factor to where we are today.
So do you think, Robert, that that executive order, another respected policy expert who I've spoken to said that was more aimed at protecting Qatar from Iran, not from protecting from Israel? I don't buy that. I think it was to show the Qataris that they would have their back. Do you think it was aimed at Israel or aimed at Iran or aimed at just reassuring Qatar that no more surprise attacks will be forthcoming?
So look, I think we risk over intellectualizing this. I think the emir of Qatar and the president of the United States have a good personal relationship and have actually beyond a good personal relationship. Um, uh, um, and This was the moment for the Qataris to cash in on something that neither of their principal Arab competitors, the Emiratis or the Saudis, was able to ever get from the United States. And they both wanted it. They both wanted this sort of defense guarantee, the Emirates and the Saudis. But this moment was a unique moment for the Qataris to cash in with Donald Trump and to get it. And that's what they did.
This is a question from a former high-ranking Maryland elected official whose name shall remain anonymous. Taking as suggested at the widest level, how does the rescue of 24 live persons justify the killing of so many children?
So I have to question the premise of the question. I'm sorry. The Israelis, I don't believe is the case, and I think the facts bear it out, are not purposefully, with intent or malice, killing Palestinian children. Um, uh, um, the Israelis are, we can have an argument or a discussion about the wisdom of the Gaza City operation, although it does now appear that it is having a positive benefit on pressure on Hamas. One has to rethink this. Um, uh, um, but it is, I think it is I think it is wrong, politically, morally, to be accusing the Israelis of purposefully killing Palestinian children. That's not what this war is about. That's not what Israeli soldiers are in Gaza to do. And it is, I think, a mark of the regrettable success of Hamas's strategy, that such questions are being posed.
What happens? We've been hearing about this more, Robert, in the paper about clans taking on responsibilities for areas in Rafah, Khan Yunis, and Beit Jal, about not forming sort of anti-Hamas clans with the backing of Israel. I mean, I don't know how much of that is true. It's kind of like occasionally we're reading about it. What would happen to these? Do you think would happen to these sort of clan forces under this arrangement, or are they even a force to be? Are they even a force, or just they rule over a couple blocks and they're being magnified in the media?
So, look, there are pieces to this puzzle, of which, clans, local leaders, local chieftains, etc., can play a role, but they are not the answer. They are not a potential governing body. They are not viewed as legitimate leaders. They're actually, in many cases, they are, local gangs, who will be rented out to the highest bidder. Um, uh, um, they may be effective in one area and ineffective in another area. They may have control over this neighborhood, but not that neighborhood. But I don't think that they represent a strategic shift or a strategic opportunity. Um, uh, um, there needs to be, and I think this is recognized by all parties, there needs to be a force that emerges that is a protection force for civilians. Um, uh, um, and there needs to be an implementation force, that actually executes the responsibilities of governance. That's what this plan is designed to make up, designed to do. The very local clans may play a role in this, but I don't think they, in and of themselves, are the answer that people are looking for.
Two last questions, unless we get any other good ones that come in. The two-state solution, is it the only path forward for peace, or are there other possible models?
So, it's a good question. It's at the moment quite a theoretical question, of course. Um, in the Israeli political context, even uttering the phrase two-state solution from almost left to right, not quite all the way to the left, but pretty far to the left, is viewed as beyond the pale, as just not something that Israel can conceive of doing. They cannot conceive of taking the witch's brew that was Gaza on October 6th and transporting it to the West Bank, which, of course, is right in the heart of Israel, not on Israel's border. Now, that being said, this 20-point peace plan does include at its very end, a pathway toward Palestinian self-determination, which may open the door to a discussion of Palestinian statehood. That's pretty much the words of the of the final point of the plan. We are very far away from that, where we are today. But let me answer the question this way. Somewhere along the line, we did blur the distinction between two things. Separation between Israel and the Palestinians and a two-state solution. They're not necessarily the same thing. They can be the same thing, but they're not necessarily so. So, for example, separation that Israel and Palestinians, that Israelis and Palestinians cannot be governed by a single authority in the land west of the Jordan River. I think a large percentage of Israelis support that concept. Now, actually, what do you do with it? How do you separate? Under what terms? Under what functional arrangements does that separation occur? That is where we still don't have a clear answer. Creating two states, two independent sovereign states, is one such possibility. It's not the only possibility. Some people are. I know my friend Elliot Abrams recently wrote a piece resurrecting the idea of a variation of the Jordan option, which doesn't mean the Jordanians coming in to take over Nablus, because that isn't going to happen. But it does mean some sort of linkage between whatever polity emerges in part or all of the West Bank with the Jordanian monarchy. Well, that might make things more palatable to Israelis. It might make things more distasteful to Palestinians. We have to work this out. My point is simple. That is separation, which is something that, as I said a moment ago, I think a large majority, not all, don't get me wrong, but a large majority of Israelis would endorse, does not necessarily end up in a two-state solution. And this is where, with the passage of time, hopefully with the successful implementation of whatever we're trying to do in Gaza, we may be able to come up with arrangements which do meet the minimum demands of Palestinians without exceeding the maximum fears of Israelis.
Last question is, where do you think this leaves normalization between Israel and other Arab states?
Well, this too is also a very good question. The way the Trump peace plan was written, it was written in such a way that it might satisfy the requirements of other Arab states to enter the Abraham Accords, because the plan itself includes, as I said a moment ago, it includes that pathway undetermined without a timetable, but it does include that pathway to a Palestinian state. Now, the Israelis have said there will be no Palestinian state, but yet they endorsed the plan. But they endorsed the plan in a way that Bibi Netanyahu outlined such conditionality that, it would be, I don't want to say pigs will fly on Erev Sukkot, but that's essentially how he outlined his image of what would be required for them to reach that point. Well, is that good enough for some Arab states, especially the Saudis? My guess is probably not yet, that they're going to want to see some other practical steps occur before they're willing to move forward, but that they will not close the door on it, but that they will want to explore those steps. And then there are other states as well, the Indonesians, the Pakistanis, and then even closer to home, the Israelis and Syrians are talking about a security agreement, not a peace agreement, a security agreement. And the Israelis and the Lebanese, there is no ideological confrontation between Israel and Lebanon. They have a very minor border dispute, very minor, easily resolvable. It's not impossible to imagine that we see some progress on those two fronts as well.
So on that note, Dr. Satloff, Rob, I wanted to thank you for your thoughtful insights, for making yourself available, and for this just extraordinary, deep and insightful conversation. It was really, for those of us who are hooked on every piece of news coming out of the Middle East and Israel, I think you really helped put an excellent framework around it. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the Saudi-Pakistan military agreement. I guess that's for another call. So thank you. There are many events and gatherings that are being held in the Jewish community tomorrow and throughout the week to mark the commemoration of October 7th. We encourage you to join the JCRC in our community to help us join on the solemn day. I would be remiss as a CEO if I didn't say, please come to the JCRC Gala on October 29th. And information can be found on our website at jcouncil.org. Wishing you all Chag Sukkot Sameach, and thank you for joining us. Be well and safe, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.